It was supposed to be just another quiet evening, the kind where the air is thick with the weight of the coming storm, where the trees whisper secrets to the wind, and the roads stretch empty under the dim glow of streetlights. But for one man, on that night, on that deserted stretch of land, there was something waiting. A crate. Wooden, worn, and barely large enough to hold what was inside. A discovery that would unravel into a puzzle so disturbing, so inexplicable, that it would torment investigators for decades. Inside lay a boy, small, frail, his skin pale against the rough wooden edges that held him. He should have had a name, a family, someone searching for him. But there was nothing. No records, no reports. No one had come forward to claim him. It was as if he had been plucked from existence and left here, discarded like an afterthought. The officers who arrived at the scene hesitated before stepping closer. The silence around them was heavy, unnatural. Even the birds had gone quiet. Something about this didn't feel right. This wasn't an ordinary case. And then came the questions. Who was he? Why had no one reported him missing? And the most unsettling of all, how long had he been here before someone finally noticed? They searched for answers. They followed every lead. They pleaded with the public, hoping that someone, anyone, would recognize him. But the more they searched, the deeper the mystery became. Because the truth wasn't just hidden, it was buried. The boy in the crate was more than just an unsolved case. He was a message, a warning, a lingering whisper in the shadows of a world that would rather forget than remember. For years, the case lay cold, a ghost of an investigation collecting dust in the archives. Until now, because the past never truly stays buried, and the truth always finds a way back. Stay with us as we unravel one of the most haunting mysteries in history. It was early morning when the hunter set out, his boots crunching against frost-bitten leaves. The woods were quiet, too quiet. No rustling of small creatures, no distant chirps of birds greeting the dawn. Just an eerie stillness pressing in from all sides. The air was sharp, biting against his skin, and somewhere deep in his gut, an unease settled. Something wasn't right. That was when he saw it. A wooden crate, half hidden among brittle branches, tilted slightly, as if it had been carelessly placed. At first it looked like discarded junk, the kind that people dump when they think no one's watching. But as he stepped closer, his breath caught in his throat. The lid was slightly ajar. Inside, something pale, a child, motionless, small limbs folded unnaturally within the tight space, as if he had been placed there without care. His skin, ghostly against the splintered wood, bore marks of a life that had been anything but kind. Faint bruises patterned his arms, his legs. His ribs, sharp beneath thin skin, hinted at hunger that had stretched on for too long. His hair had been cut recently, too recently for someone meant to be forgotten. Someone had cared for him, but not enough to keep him safe. The hunter stumbled back, the metallic taste of fear rising in his throat. He wanted to look away, to pretend he hadn't seen what he just saw. But he couldn't. His shaking hands reached for his radio, his voice barely steady as he called it in. Minutes stretched into an eternity before the first patrol car arrived. The officers stepped out, their breath visible in the freezing air. They weren't prepared for what they were about to find. One of them, a man who had seen his share of tragedies, took a single glance inside the crate and swore under his breath. The other hesitated, his hands hovering just above the rough wood, as if touching it would make this nightmare real. A child abandoned in a crate, left to be forgotten. No identification, no missing persons report, no frantic parents searching for him. The officers exchanged glances, the weight of unspoken thoughts hanging between them. Who was he? And more terrifying, Who had put him here? The official report was filed within hours. The boy, estimated to be around 6 years old, had no visible signs of struggle. He had been cleaned, groomed, almost as if he had been prepared for something. The only certainty was that he hadn't been there long. Someone had placed him in that spot recently, but why? Theories swirled like smoke. Had he wandered off only to meet a tragic end? Had he been taken from a home that didn't want him anymore? Or was the truth far worse, something no one wanted to say out loud? The questions piled up, each one heavier than the last, and as the investigation deepened, a chilling realization settled in. Someone out there knew exactly what had happened to this child, and they had no intention of ever coming forward. The boy had no name, no past, only questions that no one could answer. His small body, carefully laid in the crate, bore silent testimony to a story the world was never supposed to hear. The coroner worked in silence, his experienced hands moving over the fragile frame. The room was cold, sterile, yet the weight of what lay before him pressed down with an unseen force. The child had not been lost to an accident. That much was clear. His ribs told a story of hunger that stretched far too long. His limbs, beneath their pale skin, carried the faint traces of pain endured in silence. Old fractures, long healed, never treated properly. And then there was the hair, recently cut, too fresh to be overlooked. Someone had cared, but not in the way that mattered. Then came the strangest part, his clothes, or rather the absence of anything that could help them trace where he came from. The labels had been removed, carefully snipped away as if someone had gone to great lengths to erase his past. No name stitched into the fabric, no clue of a place he once belonged. The officers gathered around, staring at the report as if it might suddenly rearrange itself into answers. This kid didn't just appear out of nowhere. One of them muttered, rubbing a hand over his tired face. Someone had to know him. Someone had to care. But if they did, why had no one stepped forward? Days passed, turning into weeks. Investigators knocked on doors, showed sketches, asked the same question over and over. Have you seen this boy? Faces blurred together, some sympathetic, some indifferent. No one knew him, or at least no one admitted to knowing him. The newspapers ran his picture, the sketch capturing his small, delicate features. The headline screamed the question haunting the entire city. Who was the boy in the crate? Theories swarmed like flies, each one more unsettling than the last. Had he been abandoned by a family too ashamed to claim him? Had he escaped from somewhere that no child should ever have been? Or worse, had he been part of something much bigger, something hidden in the shadows, where children vanish and no one speaks their names? For every question asked, more emerged. If he had parents, why hadn't they reported him missing? If he had escaped, why had no one come looking? And if someone had wanted to get rid of him, why leave him in a place where he was certain to be found? The city buzzed with speculation. Strangers whispered their own versions of the story. Some swore they had seen a boy like him before, wandering the streets alone. Others claimed he must have been taken from somewhere far away, his past scrubbed clean before being left behind. The case refused to fade. Each new lead led to nothing but dead ends, each clue dissolved into the fog of uncertainty. Somewhere out there, the truth was waiting. But would it ever be found? The whispers started quietly, just murmurs among those who had seen too much but were too afraid to speak. Then, little by little, the rumors took shape, turning into something that couldn't be ignored. An orphanage on the outskirts of town, a place that was supposed to be a refuge, a home for children who had nowhere else to go. But not all places meant for safety are safe. The investigators had combed through every missing child report, every school record, every name of every boy around the same age. Nothing fit. until a retired social worker hesitantly stepped forward. "There was a child," she said, her voice unsteady, "one who looked just like him." Her hands trembled as she placed an old, worn notebook on the desk. Pages filled with handwritten notes, names, dates. Most had official records attached, but there, at the bottom of a page, was a single entry that stood out. No last name, no birth certificate, just a first name and a note scribbled beside it. "Transferred, no record found." The social worker hesitated. He was at the Wilburn Home for Children. That place, things weren't right there. Wilburn. The name meant little to the younger officers, but the older ones exchanged uneasy glances. It had been shut down years ago, not because it had served its purpose, but because there had been whispers, terrible ones, about how the children were treated. Nothing had ever been proven, but stories of neglect, harsh punishments, and missing paperwork had lingered long after its doors had closed. The owner, a woman known only as Miss Reed, had been questioned back then, but no charges were filed. She had vanished not long after, but now, her name was back in the air, heavy with suspicion. The officers arrived at the property, its remains standing like the bones of something long dead. The building was hollowed out, abandoned for years, windows broken, nature reclaiming its space. Yet something about it still felt occupied, still occupied. A neighbor, an elderly man who had lived nearby for decades, watched them approach. He shook his head. "You won't find much. They covered everything up real good." "Who did?" He exhaled slowly, glancing over his shoulder as if the ghosts of that place might hear him. "The ones who ran it." The officers stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the dim interior. The walls were peeling, the floors sagging under years of neglect. But then, in one of the back rooms, they found it. A locked cabinet, rusted but still standing. It took force to pry it open, but when they did, a collection of old yellowed files spilled out. Names, dates, but more than that. Notations in the margins. Transferred, removed from records, no longer here. And then, the worst of it, a list of children who had come in but had no record of ever leaving. The boy's description matched one of them, a child that should have existed but officially never had. Miss Reed had vanished years ago, no known relatives, no known location, but someone, somewhere, had to know the truth. Because children don't just disappear, unless someone makes them. The phone call came late one evening, long after the case had turned cold. A woman, voice hushed and unsteady, claimed she knew who the boy was. Not just a theory, not just a guess. She said she knew. "My mother had him," she whispered. "She told me before she died." She wouldn't give her name, only that she was calling from a payphone, watching every shadow around her as if someone might be listening. The detectives pressed her for details, and slowly the truth, or something close to it, unraveled. Her mother had taken in a child, not through adoption, not through any legal means, but through something far darker, a transaction, a deal made behind closed doors. She hadn't found him. She had bought him. The woman had been just a child when the boy appeared in her home, frail and silent, as if he had already learned that speaking too much was dangerous. "He never told me his name," she admitted. "Or maybe he did, and I just forgot. But he wasn't happy. He never smiled." She described a mother who was both possessive and cruel, someone who saw children as objects, as things to be controlled. The boy was treated differently from the rest, kept apart, always watched. Then one day, he was gone. No explanation, no mention of where he had gone or why. Just silence, and her mother's cold stare when she asked. Years later, when her mother was on her deathbed, guilt bled through. A confession, whispered through failing breath. "I tried to help him," she had said, but it was too late. The woman on the phone hesitated, then asked something no detective wanted to hear. If she wasn't the one who hurt him, then who was? They investigated her claims. Some details matched the autopsy, the healed injuries, the signs of long-term malnutrition, but others led nowhere. The woman's mother was long dead. Any records, if they ever existed, were gone, and no one had reported a missing child matching the boy's description. So was she protecting someone? Lying? Or had her mother truly been a piece of a much larger puzzle? But there was something else, something more disturbing. Some stories feel like conspiracies, too awful to be real, too convenient to ignore. But this one had names. The rumors had started years before. A whisper of something happening behind locked doors, something hidden beneath layers of secrecy and power. It involved an underground facility, one that wasn't supposed to exist, where medical procedures were conducted on those who wouldn't be missed. Orphans? Runaways? Forgotten children. The boy's injuries told a story. Malnourished but not starved. Healed fractures as if he had been treated but not cared for. His hair had been cut, but his body showed signs of long-term neglect. It was a contradiction. Someone had looked after him, but whoever they weren't kind. The whispers suggested he had been part of something far bigger than a single case of abuse. That he had been used. There were reports, hidden in old medical journals, of experimental treatments being tested on those who had no voice to refuse. Some of the injuries on his body aligned with procedures that had been documented in underground research studies. A child with no identity, no history, would be the perfect subject. But if that were true, if the boy had been part of something hidden, then the real question wasn't just who hurt him. It was who made sure no one would ever find out. And if that answer was buried, then maybe it was meant to stay that way. There was a name that kept appearing in old reports. A boy, gone long before anyone ever found the one in the box. A child of wealth, born into a family whose last name carried weight in the city. He had vanished young, not officially, of course. There was never a missing persons report, never an announcement in the papers, but there were whispers, a private matter, handled behind closed doors. He was sickly, they said, frail, struggling since birth, and one day he simply wasn't there anymore. People who worked for the family were let go around that time, servants dismissed, nurses paid off. Some were relocated, others disappeared entirely. The few who spoke about it years later did so with hesitation, like they were recalling something they weren't supposed to know. I remember the boy. A former maid had said in a rare interview, decades after the fact. He was quiet, always inside. Then she paused. He had the same eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make investigators wonder. If the boy in the box had once belonged to a family with power, with influence, then how had he ended up discarded in an empty lot? And more importantly, why hadn't they come forward? The more they searched, the more they found pieces that didn't fit. Old hospital records with names redacted, a birth certificate that led nowhere, a child who existed on paper, but not in reality. It was possible, wasn't it? That he had been hidden away, an embarrassment to a family that needed perfection, and when keeping him a secret became too difficult, they had found another way. Money could erase a lot, but could it erase this? The case had been public. His image had been everywhere, and yet no one had stepped forward to claim him. Even if his parents were gone, even if time had erased those who had once known him, there would have been someone, a distant relative, a childhood friend, a single person who might have recognized the shape of his face, the curve of his smile. But there was nothing. Just a boy in an unmarked grave, buried with a name that was never his. If any of the theories were true, the illegal adoption, the medical experiments, the family secret, then someone, somewhere, had been hiding something. The final question wasn't just about who had let this happen. It was about who had made sure he stayed forgotten. Years passed, and the case faded into the background, replaced by new headlines, fresh tragedies. But for a few, it never left. Detectives carried it with them, through promotions, transfers, even retirement. The image of the boy, small and fragile, stayed locked in their minds. They had spent their careers chasing a truth that refused to be caught. One officer, long retired, still kept a file on his desk. He would open it late at night, stare at the old black and white photographs. He had traced every lead, knocked on doors that had long since closed. And yet the answer had remained just beyond his reach. Then something changed. Forensic science had advanced. DNA, once an unreliable puzzle piece, had become a key. In recent years, databases expanded, family trees reconstructed, long-lost relatives discovered. So, the case was reopened. The boy, nameless for so long, was tested against new records, and a match appeared. It wasn't a direct link, not a mother or father, but a distant relative, a connection to a family in a neighboring town, one that had once reported a missing child. The timeline fit. The features matched. It should have been the answer they had waited for. But something was wrong. The family, when contacted, seemed reluctant. Not grief-stricken, not relieved, just hesitant. Details didn't line up. The missing boy they had reported had supposedly been found years ago, taken in by a distant cousin, raised quietly, away from questions. So why did the DNA say otherwise? Investigators pressed further, but doors shut quickly. The relatives who could have known the truth were gone. The records that should have existed had vanished. It was as if someone had spent years ensuring that the real story never surfaced. One detective nearing the end of his life made a quiet confession. "We had the answer once," he murmured. "We were so close." Then after a long pause, "But something always stopped us." And with that, the case remained where it had always been, on the edge of resolution, held back by unseen hands. The boy had a name now, but even with it, the truth felt just out of reach. And so, after decades of searching, the boy finally had a name. But did he ever really get justice? If the truth was buried, who made sure it stayed that way? And why? This case remains one of the most disturbing mysteries in history. A child lost in the shadows, his past erased, his story rewritten. If someone out there still holds the final piece of the puzzle, will they ever come forward? Or will his voice remain unheard forever? What do you think happened? Could the truth have been covered up all along? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you found this story as unsettling as we did, make sure to subscribe for more real-life mysteries that refuse to be forgotten. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update, and share this video, because somewhere out there, the truth is still waiting to be found.